Hello, everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was one of those days when everything felt muted, as though the world itself had been wrapped in a blanket of fog, dampening sound and softening the edges of reality. I had been walking for hours aimlessly, trying to clear my mind. The weight of the day's thoughts, work, life, old memories, had grown too much, and the streets of the city felt like the only escape. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just walked, my feet carrying me through quiet neighborhoods, down familiar roads past parks and shops, until the city began to give way to more open land. The edges of town where the roads turned into dirt and the buildings grew sparse. I wandered further, my footsteps crunching against the gravel as I moved along the quiet road that stretched out ahead of me. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and fresh grass, the kind of clean, sharp scent that felt grounding. I could see the horizon in the distance, a faint line where the earth met the sky, the colors of the setting sun painting everything in soft oranges and deep purples. There was a certain peace in it, the kind that comes from being alone, far away from the noise of the city, where the only sound is the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. I reached a small hill, the road winding gently upward, and when I crested the rise, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the road, her back to me, her figure outlined against the fading light. She wasn't facing me, but I could tell from the way she stood that she was waiting for something, or someone. She was tall, with long dark hair that fluttered in the wind, and she wore a light coat, simple but elegant, as though she belonged to this place in a way that I couldn't quite understand. There was an air of quiet calm about her, a presence that seemed to blend perfectly with the landscape, as though she were a part of the horizon itself. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. I didn't know this woman, yet I felt an inexplicable pull toward her. It was as if she were beckoning me, though she hadn't moved or said a word. I took a hesitant step forward and then another. As I drew closer, I felt the world around me grow even quieter, the sounds of nature fading, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own breath. When I was just a few feet away from her, she turned slowly, her gaze meeting mine. Her eyes were dark, almost impossibly deep, as if they held the weight of every secret the earth had ever known. She didn't speak at first, just studied me with a calm intensity, as though she had been waiting for me all along. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she pointed toward the horizon, toward the road ahead. Her gesture was simple, fluid, but it seemed to hold so much meaning. It was as if she were directing me, guiding me toward something important, something I couldn't yet understand. Her eyes never left mine as she pointed, and I felt a strange warmth in my chest, like I was being led toward something crucial. "Go," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "The path is waiting." I looked ahead, following the line of her finger. The road stretched out before me, winding into the distance, disappearing at the edge of the horizon. The land around me was peaceful, bathed in the soft light of twilight. There was no sign of danger, no reason to feel afraid. But as I stared at the road, I began to notice something else, something that hadn't been visible before. The horizon wasn't just fading into twilight, it was dissolving. The road ahead, which had once seemed like an inviting path, was now fading into something darker. A shadow was creeping up from the earth, moving slowly, silently, as if it were swallowing the light around it. The farther I looked, the darker the road became. The soft orange hues of the sunset turned into inky blackness. The land ahead swallowed whole by the shadows. I blinked, but the darkness didn't recede. It spread further, covering the road like an endless abyss. I turned to look at the woman, but she was no longer smiling. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, never left mine. It was then that I understood. The path she had shown me wasn't just a road, it was a choice. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why do you want me to go there?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer to me, her figure shifting as if she were part of the very land, as if the earth itself had bent to make space for her. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch light but grounding. "Because," she said, her voice like the wind itself, "the road never ends. But you must choose whether you want to walk it." I stood there, rooted to the spot, my chest tightening as I stared at the darkness ahead. I could feel it pulling at me, like gravity, but not in a way that felt natural. It was like the shadow was waiting for me, and with every passing moment, the darkness grew. The road, once inviting, now felt like a trap, a place that led only to something unknown, something I wasn't ready for. I looked back at her, searching her face for any sign of reassurance, any hint of what I should do. But all I saw was the quiet calm of someone who had accepted their path, who knew where they were going, someone who had already crossed the line that I now stood at. She smiled gently, but there was sadness in her eyes. The road will always be there, but you must decide if you are ready to walk it. I stood frozen, my legs unwilling to move. I didn't know what awaited me on that road, but I felt the heavy pull of the darkness in my chest. The horizon had disappeared entirely now, and all that remained was the endless blackness. The wind picked up, swirling around me in soft gusts, whispering a promise of something unknown, something I couldn't escape. I looked back at her one final time, but she was already fading, her form dissolving into the twilight, as if she had never been there at all. The road stretched out before me, the shadows now closing in, the way forward obscured by the dark. I took one hesitant step forward, the decision weighing heavily on me. The air felt thick with uncertainty, but I couldn't stop myself from taking another step, and then another. I didn't know what lay ahead, but as I moved forward, the darkness ahead seemed to move with me. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the world feels still, and everything seems to be in its place. The kind of morning where you move through your routine almost without thinking, the motions of the day already ingrained in your body. I woke up, made coffee, and read the news as I always did. Nothing out of the ordinary. I dressed in my usual attire, grabbed my bag, and stepped out of the apartment, locking the door behind me. It was just another ordinary day. I didn't notice the key in my pocket at first. It wasn't until I was halfway to work, walking through the quiet streets, that I felt something hard pressing against my thigh. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small metal key. It was old-fashioned, the kind that you might find in a dusty drawer in a grandmother's house. Simple and unadorned, with no identifying marks or labels, just a plain silver key. I stared at it for a moment, perplexed. I had no recollection of ever seeing it before, let alone carrying it with me. My pockets were empty when I left the apartment, or so I thought. I tried to remember if I had found it somewhere, if someone had given it to me, but nothing came to mind. It was as if it had simply appeared there, materialized out of thin air. For a moment I considered going back to my apartment to check if I had dropped it there, but something stopped me. A strange hesitation in my gut, like it was meant to be something more than just a forgotten object. It wasn't the kind of key that felt like it belonged to something ordinary. It felt important, like it was meant for something I didn't yet understand. I put it back in my pocket, trying to push the thought out of my head. I was already running late, and I didn't have time to dwell on something as trivial as a misplaced key. I continued my walk to the subway, the cold morning air crisp against my skin. The key, however, didn't leave my mind. I tried to focus on my workday, but the key kept gnawing at me, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. When I sat down at my desk, I pulled it out again, inspecting it more closely. There was nothing remarkable about it. No name or address etched into the metal. It wasn't a key for a mailbox or a car, not something I'd use every day. It felt like it was from a different time, a different place, a key for something I had never seen before. By lunchtime, I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to try and find out what it opened. I went to a nearby antique store, hoping that the old, rustic atmosphere would trigger some kind of recognition, but nothing came to mind. I asked the owner if he recognized it, if it might belong to some forgotten lock or chest, but he just shook his head. "It's an old key," he said with a shrug. "Could belong to anything, really. Hard to tell." I left the store feeling more unsettled than before. The key had no origin, no purpose that I could identify. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had to figure it out. It was as if it was calling to me, urging me to find its lock. That evening after work, I walked through the neighborhood, thinking about where I might try it. I passed a row of houses, and on impulse, I walked up to one with a large weathered door, the kind that looked like it belonged to a mansion from another era. I tried the key in the lock, half expecting it to work, even though I knew it wouldn't. It didn't fit. I walked to another building, this one older, a little run down, but with a similar heavy door. Again, I tried the key. Nothing. I moved through the streets, trying door after door, feeling ridiculous with each failed attempt. The key didn't fit anywhere. It seemed completely useless, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it had to fit somewhere. It had to be meant for something. As the evening wore on, I found myself walking farther from home, deeper into the city, until I reached a part of town I didn't recognize. The streets were darker, quieter, the buildings older and more neglected. I hadn't meant to walk this far, but something about the place felt oddly familiar, like I had been here before, even though I knew I hadn't. I turned a corner and found myself in front of an old apartment building. It was a strange, tall structure hidden among the others, almost like it had been forgotten by time. The windows were dark, the facade cracked with age. There was no sign of life here, no movement, just the heavy, oppressive silence that hung in the air. It felt like the city had forgotten this place. My heart pounded in my chest, the feeling of déjà vu overwhelming. I reached into my pocket, my fingers wrapping around the key. I had no reason to think it would work, no logical explanation for why I was standing there, but something inside me told me to try. I approached the building's door, the key in my hand trembling slightly. I inserted it into the lock, and to my shock, it turned. Slowly, deliberately, the door clicked open, revealing a dark hallway beyond. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my feet, and the door shut quietly behind me. I stood there for a moment, the air thick with dust, the faint scent of something old and long forgotten hanging in the atmosphere. The building was silent, but somehow alive, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I walked down the narrow hallway, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. The farther I went, the more the building seemed to come alive in a way that felt unsettling, as though I was trespassing on something sacred, something I wasn't meant to find. I passed several doors, all closed, none of them marked. But something in me urged me forward, pulled me toward the end of the hall. There, at the end of the hallway, was a door. It was different from the others. Heavier, older, with intricate carvings around the frame. It looked as though it had been untouched for years, maybe longer. And as I reached out to touch the handle, I realized something. I had been here before. My hand hesitated before turning the handle, my heart racing, a sinking feeling settling in my chest. I could feel the weight of the moment, the realization that whatever lay beyond this door was something I wasn't prepared for, something that had been waiting for me. I turned the handle and opened the door. The room inside was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw rows of old furniture, shelves covered in dust, books scattered on the floor, as if someone had been there recently and then left in a hurry. In the corner there was a large mirror, its surface cracked. And there, standing in front of it, was a younger version of myself, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't place. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. The key, the building, the mirror, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle I had never seen, a puzzle I had been unknowingly trying to solve for years. And as I stood there, staring at the reflection, I realized something chilling. The key had opened more than just a door. It had opened a part of me that I wasn't ready to face. It was a late evening, the kind where the world feels quiet, almost too quiet. The air was thick with a faint mist, the city shrouded in a soft, damp hush that seemed to absorb the usual noise. The streets were nearly deserted, just the occasional car passing in the distance or the faint sound of someone shutting a door behind them. I had finished a late dinner at a friend's house, and now I was walking home, the walk always taking the same route, a path I knew well. The night was still, and with each step I could hear the rhythmic tap of my shoes against the pavement. My mind wandered, replaying conversations, the events of the evening, the things I had said and done. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The city felt distant, wrapped in a blanket of silence that only the rain could create. But the rain hadn't fallen. It was just the heavy atmosphere that lingered in the air, making the streets feel more empty than they should. As I passed the old street lamp on the corner, the one that flickered occasionally like it had for as long as I could remember, I stopped for a moment. It wasn't just the odd calm that had settled over the street. There was something else. A subtle sense that I wasn't alone. I shook it off. Of course, I wasn't alone. People lived in these buildings. It was just that kind of night, quiet, calm, and still. Still, a strange weight settled on me like I was being watched, but when I turned around, there was no one. The street was as empty as I had expected. I resumed walking, but now there was a slight unease in my step, an extra awareness of the world around me. I glanced over my shoulder again, but the street remained vacant. Only the soft glow of the street lights illuminated the wet pavement. I kept walking, my pace quickening slightly. But then I heard it. A soft click, click, click. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. For a moment I stood there, listening to the echo of my own footsteps, trying to determine if what I had heard was real or just a trick of the wind, the sound bouncing off the walls around me. I turned my head slowly, hoping to see someone walking behind me, someone who had taken the same route. Maybe someone just as lost in their own thoughts as I had been. But when I looked, the street was still empty. I took another few steps, my breath a little shorter now, but the sound of footsteps followed, still soft but steady. The noise was distinct, rhythmic, like someone walking behind me, mirroring my own steps. The air grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as a creeping sense of dread started to crawl under my skin. I stopped again, my heart racing now. The footsteps stopped too. I turned quickly, but again there was no one. Just the empty street, silent and still. I could feel the quiet weighing heavily on me, pressing down with an almost oppressive force. The only sound was my own breathing, the air feeling colder now as though it had somehow deepened in its stillness. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. It was just my imagination, I told myself, just the mind playing tricks. I started walking again, my steps measured and hesitant, trying to shake the feeling of someone, or something, walking behind me. But then it came again, that soft click, 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 faint but undeniable. I stopped, my blood running cold. I turned sharply, expecting to see a person this time, a face, maybe someone with a quiet apology for following me so closely. But no one was there. The street remained as empty as it had been when I first started walking, and yet I knew I wasn't alone. The footsteps were there, trailing behind me, growing nearer, though when I looked over my shoulder there was no one. No figure, no movement, just empty space. I walked faster now, the sound of my footsteps quickening in time with the footsteps behind me. I couldn't hear anything but the click, click, click of someone following my every step. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to push my legs to move faster to escape, but with every stride I took, the footsteps grew louder, closer. It was as though someone was right there, just out of sight, walking so closely behind me that I could feel their presence. The street seemed to stretch on endlessly now, and the familiar landmarks I had passed 100 times blurred around me. The street lights flickered overhead, their soft glow casting long, ominous shadows across the pavement. I turned another corner, hoping the change in direction would stop whatever, or whoever, was behind me. But the footsteps stayed, never leaving, never faltering. I looked around wildly, my mind racing, wondering if I should run, but the sound was too precise, too steady. Whatever was behind me was keeping perfect time with me, matching my pace. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. And then as I rounded the next corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The street ahead was dark, the shadows pooling thickly in the corners of the alleyway, but there, in the distance, was something, someone. A figure standing perfectly still in the shadows, their face obscured by the dim light. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. I took a step back, panic rising in my chest, but the footsteps behind me didn't stop. They kept coming, drawing nearer with each passing second. I turned back around to face the figure in the shadows, hoping to somehow confront whatever it was that had been following me. But when I looked again, it was gone. The street was empty. The shadow was empty. And just like that, the footsteps stopped. I stood there, frozen, my breath shallow and erratic, the silence around me deafening. The street, the shadows, everything seemed still again, as though the world had exhaled. But the echo of the footsteps stayed with me, lingering in my mind, even though there was no one behind me. I turned around, half expecting to see the empty street still behind me, but when I did, I saw nothing. Just the wet pavement glistening under the streetlights, the sound of distant cars passing by, and the cold, unsettling feeling that had crept into my bones. The world had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still walking behind me, always there, always waiting. And for the rest of the walk home, I didn't dare look back again. It started as an ordinary evening, one that was familiar and calming, the kind of evening where everything feels almost too perfect, too still. The sun had just set, casting the sky in shades of deep purple and orange, and the streets were slowly quieting down. I had been walking home after a long day at work, my feet carrying me along the same path I'd taken countless times. I didn't even have to think about it. My body knew the way by heart. But something felt different that night. The usual noises of the street, the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bark of a dog, seemed muffled, like they were coming from another world. The air was cooler than it should have been, with a light breeze that carried a strange scent, something familiar yet unplaceable. I noticed it, but I didn't give it much thought. My mind was too preoccupied with the mundane, my thoughts about work, dinner, the fact that I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. I turned a corner just a few blocks away from my apartment when I saw the street signs. It wasn't anything unusual at first. The street signs, pointing to various roads I'd walked down many times, were all positioned at the usual intersections. But as I glanced at them, I noticed something odd. One of the signs was pointing down a road I didn't recognize. I had walked this route 100 times, and there was no road here. I could have sworn there was only a dead end at the corner. But the sign was clear. It pointed straight down the street as though inviting me to follow. I hesitated for a moment. I had never seen that road before, and yet the sign seemed so sure of itself. Almost too sure. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it. I figured I'd check it out, maybe explore a new shortcut home. I turned down the street and started walking. It wasn't long before I began to feel like something was off. The houses on this road were strange. Not strange in a way that was overtly unsettling, but strange in a way that made them seem out of place. The windows seemed darker than they should have been, and the streetlights above me flickered intermittently, casting brief shadows that shifted unnaturally across the sidewalk. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I pushed the discomfort away. It was just my imagination, I told myself. But then I looked up at the next street sign. It pointed straight ahead, but it was the same road. The same unfamiliar street. No turn, no change in direction. I was still walking down this road, but it didn't feel right. I stopped, confused, and looked around. Everything looked the same. The houses, the street, the signs. It was as if I had been walking for longer than I thought, but the scene in front of me hadn't changed. I checked the sign again. It still pointed straight ahead. But where was I going? I took another step forward, my mind racing. The street was quiet now, unnervingly so. There were no cars, no pedestrians, no dogs barking, just the faint sound of the wind in the trees and the rhythmic pounding of my own footsteps. I passed the same house again, the one with the dark windows, the one that felt like it had been watching me. My breath quickened as the feeling of being followed crept in, but I forced myself to focus. I looked ahead, searching for the next sign, hoping it would guide me somewhere familiar. But when I reached the next intersection, there was no sign at all, just the empty road ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks. The road stretched on before me, but where were the street signs? They had been so clear before, but now they were gone. I turned around, ready to go back. But when I looked behind me, I realized the road had changed. It didn't look like the same street anymore. The houses, which had been neatly spaced out, now appeared too close together, looming in on me like tall, narrow buildings, their windows black and empty. The pavement beneath my feet was cracked, the once neatly trimmed grass growing wild at the edges of the sidewalk. It was as if the road had transformed, as if the familiar street I had walked only minutes ago had warped into something else entirely. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn back, but where was the way out? The signs had disappeared. The path I had followed had led me to this place that seemed both unfamiliar and strangely suffocating. The road stretched ahead, but it didn't lead anywhere. It just stretched, endlessly, like a path meant to be walked without end. I looked to my right, half expecting to see the familiar street signs, but there was nothing. The road ahead seemed to curve into a shadowy corner, where the light from the street lamps flickered and dimmed. I took a hesitant step forward, my pulse quickening. The air was thick, and the closer I got to that corner, the more the world around me seemed to distort. The street that had seemed so familiar now felt foreign. The air felt heavier, as if it was pressing down on me, each step harder than the last. I glanced up at the sign again. It still pointed the same way, straight ahead. But the more I looked at it, the more it seemed to fade, like it was being swallowed by the shadows that crept along the street. My mind raced. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I turned away, trying to retrace my steps, trying to find the familiar path I had taken earlier. But the streets were gone. The road I had walked down was no longer there, replaced by empty, featureless spaces. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. The buildings around me were shifting again, the walls bending and twisting in ways that made my head spin. There was no way back, no way forward. The street signs were gone, the road I had followed leading me into nothingness. I stood there, helpless, as the road stretched on forever, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't going anywhere. The street signs had led me here, but they weren't guiding me to a place. They were leading me in circles, trapping me in a labyrinth that had no exit, no way out. And the more I tried to leave, the more the streets changed around me, reshaping themselves, twisting into places I didn't recognize, places that didn't exist. The signs pointed straight ahead, but I had no idea where to go anymore. The path I had followed twice was a maze, and I was lost, wandering deeper into the night, into a place that would never end. The road stretched on before me, but it never led anywhere. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that drifts by without leaving much of an impression. I had just returned from work, the familiar fatigue of the day settling into my bones as I pushed open the door to my apartment building. The hallway was quiet, just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above and the faint sound of water running somewhere in the distance. I didn't think much of it, slipping into my apartment like I always did, the door clicking shut behind me with a small, reassuring sound. I put down my bag and moved to the window, staring out at the street below. The city was alive with the usual bustle, cars honking, people walking hurriedly along the sidewalk, the occasional flash of lights as a distant siren passed. But something caught my eye as I scanned the buildings across the street. There, in one of the top-floor windows, a figure stood, watching me. At first, I thought it was just someone passing by, or perhaps a neighbor who had stopped for a moment to glance out. But when I looked again, I realized that wasn't the case. The person was still there, standing in the window, staring directly at me. Her face was barely visible through the glass, but I could make out the faint outline of her features, her eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. She wasn't moving, not at all, just standing there watching. I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine. It was an unsettling sensation, like the weight of her gaze pressed against me, pressing down into my chest. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to. There was something about the stillness of it that made my heart race, a gnawing feeling that I couldn't shake. Something was wrong. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the angle wasn't good, and the light from the street lamps reflected off the glass, distorting her figure further. Her face remained unreadable, distant. It felt like she was waiting for something. For me to notice her, maybe? Or perhaps for something more. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the growing discomfort. It was probably just someone caught in a moment of idle daydreaming, a neighbor who had no idea I was looking at them. But as I turned to move away from the window, I caught myself in the reflection of the glass. And it hit me with a sudden, icy clarity. The building across the street was empty. I froze. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, a confused expression frozen on my face. I glanced back out the window. There were no lights on in any of the floors, not a single flicker from behind the other windows. The building should have been dark, should have been just like the others across the street. But that one window, the one she was standing in, the light was on. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to see through the layers of reflection and distortion. The woman was still there, but now something else had changed. I couldn't quite place it, but there was an odd familiarity to her, something that tugged at the edge of my memory, like I should know her. I couldn't remember her face clearly, not really, but somehow it felt wrong. I pulled back from the window, my heart thudding in my chest. What was I doing? Why was I staring at this stranger's window as if it were something more? I turned around, pacing to distract myself from the unsettling feeling in my gut. The apartment felt colder now, the air thicker. I glanced back at the window again, the lingering discomfort still gnawing at me. But when I looked out, the woman was gone. Just like that, she had vanished. The window, once filled with her presence, was now empty. The lights in the building were off. But then I noticed something else. The building wasn't empty at all. There was no longer a single light on, but in the reflection of the window across the street I could see movement. Shadows, figures moving through the building. It was as though the rooms had filled with people. People I couldn't see directly, but whose movements were now visible through the reflection. I blinked, confused, rubbing my eyes. I stepped closer to the window, looking out again. But the building was still completely dark, the window staring back at me like hollow eyes. I stepped away from the window again, my thoughts a tangled mess. It was ridiculous, I told myself. I was seeing things, overthinking everything. It was just an old building with old windows and a trick of the light. Maybe the people I thought I saw in the reflection were just the shadows of trees or some other form of natural distortion. It made sense, right? But the unease had settled deep into my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I moved through the apartment, trying to distract myself with other things. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that window, to her face, to the strange reflection in the building across the street. As the night went on, I tried to ignore it. I read a book, watched some television, but each time I passed the window, I couldn't help but look. Each time I looked out, the street was quieter. The building across the street was always dark. No lights, no movement. The eerie stillness returned. By midnight, the rain had started again, falling in soft sheets against the windows. The world outside had become a blur of wet lights and shadows. I glanced at the clock, 12:03 a.m., and looked out one last time. This time, the building across the street was completely dark, its windows all shut tight, silent. But there, in that one top-floor window, the light was on again. I couldn't breathe. The woman was there, still standing, still watching. But this time, I wasn't sure if it was her I was seeing. The face in the window was still, but the figure in the reflection of the building, was no longer hers. It was mine, but I wasn't in the window. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had just finished running a few errands, the kind of quiet, unremarkable day that felt like the calm before the storm. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had parted just enough to let a little light in, giving everything a soft glow. I had no particular plans for the evening, so when I received the invitation to a gathering at an old friend's house, I decided to stop by. I hadn't seen them in a while, and I thought it would be nice to catch up. The house was in the older part of town, one of those places with creaky wooden floors and old-fashioned decor. It was the kind of house that seemed frozen in time, with photos of family members on the walls and mismatched furniture that had been passed down through generations. I had been there before years ago when we were all younger, hanging out after school, sharing stories and laughter. Walking up the front steps, I felt a sense of nostalgia wash over me, a gentle reminder of days gone by. I rang the doorbell, hearing the faint chime echo from inside. A moment passed, and then the door opened, but it wasn't my friend who greeted me. Instead, a woman I didn't recognize stood there, her face kind but slightly confused, as though she was unsure of who I was. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. I blinked, taken aback. I'm here for the gathering. I paused, glancing down at the invitation I had received earlier in the week. "This is Sarah's place, right? I thought there was a get-together here today." The woman nodded slowly. "Oh, yes, of course. Come on in," she said, stepping aside to let me in. I stepped into the foyer, a strange feeling creeping up my spine. The house was exactly as I remembered it. The familiar scent of coffee in the air, the same furniture, the same creaky wooden floors. But something felt off, a shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't the house that had changed, it was something about the people, or rather, the lack of them. The living room was full, but there were no familiar faces. The people gathered inside weren't who I expected. They were strangers to me, a mix of ages, some chatting quietly in corners, others standing in small groups. They were dressed casually, some in jeans and sweaters, others in more formal attire, but none of them looked familiar. I looked back toward the woman who had let me in, but she was already walking away, disappearing down the hall. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I leave? Maybe I had gotten the wrong address, or maybe the event had shifted to another part of the house. But something kept me standing there, as if the pull to stay was stronger than my confusion. I moved further into the room, trying to make sense of the situation. The strangers didn't seem to notice me at first. Their voices were soft, hushed, like they were speaking in a language I couldn't quite understand. The furniture was rearranged in a way that was unfamiliar, and the walls, which I once knew so well, now seemed to stretch farther, like the room had grown in size since my last visit. But everything was so vivid, so real. It was the same house, the same space, or at least it should have been. One of the strangers caught my eye. A man, sitting in an armchair near the window, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual before he turned away, resuming his quiet conversation with the woman beside him. I shifted uncomfortably, moving further into the room, my mind racing with questions. Where was Sarah? Was she still here? Had I missed her somehow? As I walked through the space, the murmur of voices grew louder, and I tried to find someone I knew. But the more I looked, the more I realized I didn't know any of them. I walked toward the kitchen, hoping to find a familiar face, but again, I only saw strangers. They moved around me as if I were invisible, passing by without a glance, as if I didn't belong here. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the sound of someone rummaging through drawers. It all felt strangely distant, like I was standing in a room full of echoes. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I looked at the faces, trying to find one that would reassure me, one that would anchor me back to reality. But every face I saw was unfamiliar, every voice just a little too distant to be real. The house seemed to shift around me, the rooms growing darker, the walls tighter. I tried to shake the feeling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, but I couldn't. I stepped out of the kitchen and into the hallway, my mind racing. What had happened here? Why was everyone acting like they knew each other but not me? I reached for my phone, thinking maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I had come to the wrong place. But when I looked at my screen, I saw the invitation again. The same message, the same address. I was at the right place. The front door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see a woman walking into the living room, Sarah. She was dressed in the same way I remembered, a soft smile on her face as she waved at the group. But when her eyes met mine, her smile faltered. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was trying to place me, but she didn't recognize me. I could feel a strange tension in the air, a sense of discomfort radiating between us. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She simply nodded, then turned away, walking further into the room as though nothing had happened. I stood there, frozen, watching her retreat. The world around me seemed to warp, stretching the space between us, turning everything into something just out of reach. I couldn't explain it. I should have felt at home here, but instead it was as though I had stepped into a different version of this place, a place that only looked familiar but didn't feel like it. I turned around, planning to leave, to walk back into the hallway, but when I glanced back toward the living room, I saw Sarah talking with the strangers again. She didn't even seem to notice me anymore. I stood there in the doorway for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Was this a mistake? Had I gotten the wrong house? But everything around me felt too real. The photographs on the wall, the old couch, the coffee table with the same worn edge, all the little details that made this place home. It was the same house, and yet it wasn't. I walked back toward the door, my heart heavy with confusion, the feeling of disconnection growing with each step. When I reached the door, I paused. The rain outside was coming down in sheets now, but I couldn't escape the nagging sensation that I had missed something, that I had overlooked something crucial. The door was open, but as I stepped outside, I glanced back one last time. The room was full again, the voices louder now, but Sarah, she wasn't there. No one was, just the emptiness, lingering in the place I thought I knew. And I realized, with a creeping certainty, that I had walked into a room I was never meant to be in. It was one of those typical mornings, the kind that felt like nothing more than a small, quiet slice of the ordinary routine. The weather outside was a mixture of rain and fog, the world blurred behind the wet windows of the train as it made its way through the city. I was on my usual commute, the same train, the same stop, the same sleepy faces around me. Nothing about it was remarkable except for the nagging sense that I was tired, too tired to care about the usual monotony. I stood by the door as I always did, watching the stations slide by. The soft hum of the train and the occasional rattle of the tracks were like a lullaby, and I let my thoughts wander, thinking about the day ahead, the things I had to do at work, and the errands I needed to run. It wasn't until we neared my stop that I started to feel something strange in the air. A shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere. The train began to slow as we approached the station, and I moved toward the door, ready to step off. But as the train pulled into the platform, something was off. I couldn't quite place it at first, but then I realized the train had stopped, but the doors didn't open. I glanced around, expecting someone to step up and push the button to release the doors, but no one moved. The other passengers, seemingly unaware, continued with their conversations, some scrolling through their phones, others lost in their own thoughts. The train sat there, silent, the doors firmly shut as if locked from the inside. I waited for a moment, expecting the usual mechanism to kick in, the soft chime, the click of the door unlocking, and the hiss of air as the doors slid open. But nothing happened. The train sat there, and I felt a small wave of unease wash over me. I pressed the button near the door, hoping it was just a glitch, maybe a malfunction in the system. The button blinked, but the doors remained stubbornly shut. I turned to look at the other passengers. None of them seemed to notice anything unusual. They were all still immersed in their own worlds. I glanced back at the platform. The train had stopped directly in front of the station's door, and yet there was no sign of life outside either. No one waiting to board, no one in a rush to get off. It was as if the world had frozen at this moment, leaving the train suspended in time. I looked at the train's digital display above the door. It read my stop's name. "This is your stop," it flashed, but still no movement. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling slightly as I grasped it, my mind racing to understand why I couldn't exit. I gave it a firm pull, expecting the usual ease, but the door didn't budge. It was locked, I realized, completely locked. I could hear the low hum of the train's engine still running, but no sound came from outside. Not even the usual buzz of city life. I felt a strange pressure building in my chest, a growing unease that started to take root. This wasn't right. I pressed the button again, harder this time, hoping for a response, but the doors remained unyielding, the faint glow of the button casting a soft, unnatural light. I turned back toward the passengers. No one had moved. They hadn't even noticed. A sudden disorienting thought crossed my mind. What if this train wasn't going anywhere? What if this wasn't my stop at all? What if I had somehow been pulled into a moment outside of time, where the train was stuck, trapped between destinations? I shook my head. I was being ridiculous. I had to get off. I pressed the button once more urgently, my thoughts spiraling into something more frantic now, but again, nothing. I looked back outside. The station beyond the glass was still empty. The platform was silent, completely deserted. A cold shiver crawled up my spine as I realized that the train wasn't just stopped. It was stuck in place. The world outside was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I wasn't sure anymore. Time had become a strange, elastic thing, stretching without meaning. My body ached to move, to get off this train, but my legs were heavy, unwilling to cooperate. My fingers were frozen against the door, gripping it tightly, unwilling to let go, even though I knew it wouldn't open. The train didn't move, didn't make any sounds except the low hum of its engine. Then something changed. I don't know how long I had been standing there, staring at the locked doors, but suddenly the train gave a small lurch. The lights above flickered for just a split second, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a shadow. But when I looked, there was nothing. Only the empty seats, the still passengers, the locked doors, and the growing silence. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding, trying to breathe steadily. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The train was still there, but the station was gone. The platform was no longer visible, and when I looked through the window, I saw only darkness, a deep, endless black that stretched out in front of us, swallowing the train, the world around us. I turned back to the passengers. They were all still in their seats, as still as statues. None of them had moved an inch. None of them had even acknowledged the fact that we hadn't moved an inch. It was as if they were all locked in a moment of their own, existing in some parallel state where time didn't function the way it should. A whisper in my mind told me to get up, to move, to run toward the front of the train and find the conductor, to scream for help, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the floor, my breath shallow as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the train lurched forward. The doors still remained shut, but now the motion was real. The sound of the wheels against the tracks returned, the faint rumble of the train shifting into gear. The station outside remained absent, but now I could see the faint outline of something in the distance. A station, perhaps, though I didn't recognize it. I turned back to the passengers, hoping for a sign, hoping for someone, anyone, to acknowledge the bizarre turn of events. But they were still seated, their eyes fixed ahead, their faces blank. It was like I was the only one who could see what was happening, the only one who knew. I pressed my hand against the cold window, watching as the dark city blurred past. The train was moving again, but the station outside never materialized. We passed through countless tracks, tunnels, and stations, but they all looked the same. Empty, dark, frozen in place. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the train stopped again. But this time, the doors didn't close. They stayed open. I stepped toward them slowly, the world outside now just a black void, a vast emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. The sound of the train's engine died away. The doors didn't open to a platform, to anything familiar. It was just darkness. I looked back at the passengers. They were still in their seats, perfectly still. I took a step forward, stepping into the darkness outside, unsure of what was waiting for me. The doors didn't close, but when I looked back, the train was gone. It was a quiet afternoon when I stumbled across it, the kind of day that invites you to linger in the stillness, a gentle kind of peace wrapping itself around you like a blanket. I had been cleaning out an old drawer in my bedroom, one that I hadn't opened in years. It was filled with miscellaneous items, old receipts, random trinkets, forgotten mementos. Most of it was stuff I didn't remember keeping, things that seemed to have accumulated over the years without any real purpose. But buried at the very bottom, under a stack of faded postcards, I found an old photograph. I froze when I saw it. The photo was in black and white, a little worn at the edges, the paper slightly yellowed with age. It was a photo of me, or rather someone who looked exactly like me. There was no mistaking it. The person in the picture had my face, my eyes, my hair. It was a younger version of myself, probably from when I was in my late teens, judging by the clothes I was wearing. I was standing outdoors, smiling in front of a building that looked vaguely familiar, yet completely unfamiliar at the same time. The thing that struck me first was the background. The building behind me was unlike anything I had ever seen. It had tall, weathered stone walls, large arched windows, and a towering spire that rose high above, piercing the sky. The architecture was old, almost Gothic, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't any place I recognized. The trees around me were thick with leaves, casting long, soft shadows on the ground, and the entire scene had an air of mystery to it. The photo was taken in a place I knew I had never been. I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine as I stared at it. My mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I had never visited any place like that. I could remember almost every significant trip I'd taken in my life, every place I'd been. But this place was completely foreign. I turned the photo over, hoping to find some clue, some note or date written on the back. But there was nothing. Just the smooth, blank surface of the paper, as if it had been left intentionally untouched. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just a mistake, maybe something from a dream or an old memory. I might have visited a similar building once, or perhaps it was a place I had seen in a movie. But the longer I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. I couldn't explain why, but something about that photo seemed wrong, as if it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to put it out of my mind. I tucked the photo back into the drawer and carried on with my day. But the image lingered in the back of my thoughts, refusing to let go. I kept imagining that place, the eerie, towering building, the dense trees that surrounded it, and the strange sense of familiarity it evoked, even though I was certain I had never been there. The next day, I couldn't help myself. I took the photo out again and examined it more closely. I was looking for some kind of clue, something that would explain where it had come from or how it was possible that I had never been to this place, yet had a photo of myself standing in front of it. As I studied the image, I noticed something I hadn't seen the first time. A person standing just behind me, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. They were blurry, out of focus, but their figure was distinct enough for me to make out. It was a woman, her features partially hidden by the darkness. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could tell she was staring directly at me. My pulse quickened, and I felt a sudden wave of unease wash over me. I had no recollection of anyone else being there, no memory of a woman in my life who could have been present in that moment. I had never taken a photo in a place like that, and certainly not with someone standing behind me. The more I looked at her, the more a sinking feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I decided to do what I should have done earlier. I Googled the image of the building. I searched for every variation of the description I could think of. Gothic stone building, tall spire, old university campus, but nothing came up. It was as if the place didn't exist. No matches, no historical records, no photographs, nothing. I couldn't stop myself from searching. I expanded my search, looking for anything related to that style of architecture, even the trees, or any landmark that resembled the scene in the photograph. But the more I looked, the more frustrated I became. It was like the building, the place, was a ghost. It existed only in the photo in my memory, but nowhere else. It wasn't until a week later that I made a connection. I was scrolling through my social media feed, absent-mindedly passing the time, when I saw a post from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She had posted an album of photos from her trip to Europe, and as I flipped through the images, one of them caught my eye. The same building, the same towering spire, the same dense trees. It was exactly like the one in the photo I had found. I clicked on the image to zoom in, my heart pounding in my chest. The photo was taken in a city I had never visited, a place I had never planned to go. I immediately scrolled down to the caption, hoping it would explain how the building was connected to her trip. And that's when I saw it. A small mention at the bottom of the post. Visited the old abbey in the countryside. It was so surreal walking through the gates where my grandmother once lived. My grandmother. I didn't even know my grandmother had ever lived in Europe, let alone in a place like that. I'd never heard her mention it. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to piece together the connection. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to understand. The photo of me, taken in a place I had never been, had somehow linked me to my grandmother, someone I never associated with this kind of history. I tried to call my mother, hoping she could shed some light on this, but as the phone rang, I glanced down at the photo once more. This time, the woman standing behind me was clearer. I could see her face now, her expression just barely visible in the shadows. And as the phone continued to ring, my breath caught in my throat. It was my grandmother's face. The woman in the photo, the one I had never seen before, was the same woman I had never known. And somehow, that photo, taken in a place I couldn't remember, had been waiting for me all along. I didn't speak to my mother that day. I couldn't bring myself to ask her about the photo, about the place, about my grandmother's hidden past. Because the more I thought about it, the more certain I became of one thing. I hadn't just found that photo. It had found me. And it had come from somewhere I wasn't ready to go. It was one of those cold mornings that linger just long enough to make you regret not bringing a thicker coat. The city had been drenched in a soft fog, the kind that makes everything seem a little too far away, like the world was just out of reach. I was running late, as usual, so I stopped by my favorite cafe on the way to work. It was the kind of place that felt like a second home. Small, cozy, with an old wooden counter and mismatched chairs, the smell of freshly brewed coffee always filling the air. It was quiet in there, the kind of place you could slip into and lose yourself in a book or in your thoughts. I liked that about it. As I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the cafe wrapped around me, immediately comforting in its simplicity. The barista behind the counter smiled at me, a small, quiet gesture that always felt welcoming. I stepped up to the counter, ready to order my usual a latte with just a little extra foam. But as I approached, I noticed something that didn't quite sit right. The lights above the counter flickered for a moment, and then the woman behind the counter, the one who always greeted me, looked up at me and gave a slow, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The cafe's closed for the day." I blinked, taken aback. Closed? I had walked past the cafe just last night, and it had been open, as it always was. It wasn't even late yet, just a little past the usual rush hour. I looked around, thinking maybe she meant it was closing early, but the lights were still on, and the tables were set up like they always were. Everything seemed normal, except for the woman's words. "Closed?" I repeated, my voice sounding more confused than I intended. "But it's open, isn't it?" She shook her head slowly, a polite but firm smile still on her face. "No, it's closed. Sorry about that. I can't serve you today." I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The strange part was that everything looked normal, like any other day. The cafe felt warm, inviting, open. I could hear the low hum of the espresso machine in the back, the clink of cups being stacked, the soft murmur of distant conversation. But when I looked at her face again, there was something unsettling in the way she held that smile, as if she was trying to reassure me that this was the truth. I took a step back, feeling a little awkward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The cafe was without a doubt open, yet she was insisting that it was closed. I turned, unsure if I should just leave or ask again, when I heard the door behind me jingle. Another customer had just walked in. I turned, half expecting to see them leave when they heard the news, but they didn't. They walked up to the counter with a cheerful smile, greeted by the same barista, who now looked at them with a much warmer expression than she had given me. "Good morning," the customer said. "I'll have the usual." "Of course," the barista replied, her voice completely different now, more relaxed, more natural. She began making the drink without hesitation, and I stood there utterly confused. I glanced back and forth between the woman behind the counter and the customer ordering without a second thought. Had I imagined the entire conversation? Had she not said the cafe was closed just moments ago? I looked at the clock on the wall, and it seemed completely out of place, too. It wasn't working. The hands were stuck, frozen at 9:32, a time I knew couldn't have been the right one. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of confusion clouding my thoughts. The door jangled again, another customer stepped in, and then another, all as if they were walking into an ordinary cafe. They all moved through the door like it was open for business, chatting casually with the barista, receiving their drinks without question, like there was no strange pause in time. I stepped away, trying to make sense of it all, the strange pull to leave and the overwhelming feeling that I had to get away from this place. But I couldn't stop myself from looking back one last time. The barista looked at me, her smile still polite but distant, almost like she had no idea who I was. "Have a good day," she said, her voice warmer now, but there was something in her tone that made my skin prickle. I nodded, took a deep breath, and walked out, the door jiggling behind me as I stepped back onto the street. The cold air hit me sharply, and for a moment I couldn't understand what had just happened. I stood on the corner for a long time, staring back at the cafe through the fog. It was the same place, the same windows, the same sign, but everything inside had changed. The warmth, the familiarity, all of it had disappeared in the blink of an eye, replaced by something I couldn't explain. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a deep, unsettling feeling growing in my chest. I told myself I would return tomorrow to ask about it, to clear up the confusion. But when I came back the next morning, the cafe was gone. The windows were boarded up and the sign was missing, replaced by a dark, empty storefront. No lights, no sounds, just a vacant space in the street where the cafe had once been. I stood there staring at the building, my heart racing. I thought about the woman's face, her smile, The way she had told me the cafe was closed when everything around me said otherwise. I thought about the customers who walked in without hesitation, like nothing was strange at all. But now the street was silent. The cafe was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had never really been there at all. It was one of those rainy afternoons where the world seemed to slip into a quiet haze. The kind of rain that doesn't pour, but falls in a constant soft drizzle, leaving the streets slick and the air thick with dampness. I had just left work, tired, the familiar weight of the day pressing down on me. My usual walk home was simple, almost automatic at this point. I knew the route so well that I barely thought about it anymore. It was a route I had taken hundreds of times, through the same quiet streets, past the same row of houses, and across the same intersections. As I left the office, I pulled my coat tighter around me, pulling the collar up to shield myself from the chill of the damp evening. I began my walk, my footsteps soft against the wet pavement, the rhythm of my boots providing a comforting, predictable beat. The rain was steady, tapping against my umbrella, but it wasn't enough to drown out the quiet hum of the street. There was something calming about it, about the routine of it all. But that night something felt different. It started subtly, a strange unease I couldn't quite place. I had walked this path countless times, so why did the street seem unfamiliar now? At first I brushed it off. The houses on my left were the same old Victorian-style buildings that had always been there. The trees on my right, tall and barren from the onset of fall, were the same, their limbs swaying gently in the breeze. But something about the way the street looked in the rain, it felt colder. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, longer than they should have been. The houses seemed to sit further apart, though I knew they were the same distance as they always had been. I kept walking, my mind trying to shake the feeling of disorientation. I came to the first intersection, where I would normally turn left, the path leading toward my neighborhood. But tonight something tugged at me, urging me to continue straight. It wasn't like me to stray from my usual route, but for some reason, I decided to follow that strange instinct. Perhaps it was just the rain, making everything feel a little off-kilter. I stepped forward, not thinking twice, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet street. I didn't know how long I had been walking when I first noticed it, but by the time I did, it was too late to turn back. The neighborhood around me had changed. The buildings, the houses, the feel of the street itself, it was all different. I should have been in the heart of my neighborhood by now, familiar streets with the old cafe I always passed, the small park near the corner. But as I looked around, nothing was familiar. The houses had grown taller, the streets had narrowed, and the streetlights overhead cast strange, harsh shadows, illuminating nothing but the wet pavement beneath my feet. I felt a shiver run through me. The air had changed too. It was colder, almost biting, and there was a strange smell that lingered in the air, faint but noticeable. It wasn't the scent of rain or wet earth. It was something different, something old. I stopped at the next corner, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The street sign was unfamiliar, and though I had been walking for what felt like only a few minutes, I was sure I had crossed into a different part of town altogether. It wasn't just the streets that felt different, though. The entire atmosphere was wrong. The buildings were quieter now, their windows dark, their doors shut tight. There was no movement, no sign of life. Even the rain seemed to have softened, the patter against my umbrella barely audible. It felt like the world had become hollow, an empty shell that only pretended to be a place I recognized. I turned back the way I had come, intending to retrace my steps, but when I tried, the street looked different. The path I had just walked down, the one that should have led me home, was now a maze of unfamiliar roads. I looked around, disoriented, but no matter which direction I turned, the same strange houses, the same narrow streets stretched out in front of me. I tried to call someone, to check my phone, but the signal was dead. No messages, no calls, just an empty screen staring back at me. Panic rose in my chest, but I tried to keep calm. I had to keep walking. I had to find my way out of this strange, abandoned part of the city. I continued on, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The rain kept falling, the quiet of the streets wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I passed the same corner twice, and then again a fourth time. I had walked in a circle, but the streets kept changing subtly with every turn. The houses were the same, yet not quite. The trees had shifted their positions, the shadows a little longer than before. It was as if the world around me was adjusting, bending, shifting, until I could no longer tell if I was in the same place or if I had wandered into some kind of parallel version of my neighborhood. I finally stopped in the middle of the street, trying to steady my breath. I could feel the tension in my body, the discomfort of being in a place that seemed so familiar yet so wrong. I was sure I hadn't gone far. The street should have led to the park I usually passed, the one where the old fountain sat in the middle. I turned around, determined to retrace my steps, but the park wasn't there. The fountain wasn't there. The corner I had passed earlier, where I knew I should have turned, had disappeared. In its place was a tall building, its walls stark and cold, with no windows, no doors. It stood alone in the middle of the street, a looming structure that had no business being there. It felt like it was watching me, like it had always been there, waiting. I tried to step forward, but something held me back. A voice, or something like it, whispered just beyond my hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, the sound too familiar, too personal. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt like it was speaking to me, calling me by name, beckoning me forward. But I couldn't move. I turned back toward the street I had come from, but the path I had walked earlier was gone. The streetlights had turned off, leaving me in total darkness, the shadows stretching unnaturally long in the absence of light. I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that I was trapped. The path I had taken twice, the one I had always known so well, had become something else entirely. The streets were not what they should have been. The city had changed, and I had no way of knowing which direction to go anymore. I looked around one last time, hoping to see something familiar, something that would guide me back. But there was nothing. Just the eerie silence, the rain falling softly around me, and the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. As I stood there, the weight of the realization settling in, I felt a shift. A strange hum filled the air, faint but growing louder, as if the world was preparing to move again. The streets were changing, twisting, folding into themselves, and I knew deep down that no matter how many times I walked the same path, I would never end up in the same place again.